Well, good morning. I have to say I'm terribly excited to be here. I've been having so many awesome conversations in the hall, in the bathroom, out at the tables, so it's really wonderful to be here. Thank you for putting this all together. I want to start by sort of indulging in a longish quote from somebody I'm reading named Virginia Postindustrial. Quote, "From the moment we're wrapped in a blanket at birth, we are surrounded by textiles. They cover our bodies, bedeck our beds, and carpet our floors. Textiles give us seatbelts and sofa cushions, tents and bath towels, medical masks, and duct tape. They are everywhere." But Postindustrial continues, to reverse Arthur C. Clarke's famous adage about magic, quote, "Any sufficiently familiar technology is indistinguishable from nature," end quote. She goes on, "It seems intuitive, obvious, so woven into the fabric of our lives that we take it for granted. We no more imagine a world without cloth than one without sunlight or rain. We drag out heirloom metaphors on tenterhooks, tow-headed, frazzled, with no idea that we're talking about fabrics and fibers. We repeat threadbare cliches, whole cloth, hanging by a thread, dyed in the wool. We catch airline shuttles, weave through traffic, follow comment threads. We speak of lifespans and spin-offs and never wonder why drawing out fibers and twirling them into thread looms so large in our language. Surrounded by textiles, we're largely oblivious to their existence. Well, maybe not in this room, and to the knowledge and efforts embodied in every scrap of fabric," end quote. Every scrap of fabric has a hand and a history attached to it. Fabric really is too good to waste. As I've opened the door to science fiction, one of my favorite topics, and I feel like we're living in science fiction these days, let's go the whole hog and quote the other two laws from Arthur C. Clarke. 1, when distinguished but elderly scientists state that something is possible, they are almost certainly right. When they state that something is impossible, they are very probably wrong. 2, the only way of discovering the limits of the possible is to venture a little way past them into the impossible. At Accelerating Circularity, our mission is to create new supply chains and business models to turn textile waste into mainstream, and I stress mainstream, raw materials. Our vision is a world in which textiles are no longer wasted. We like to think of ourselves as a do tank, but we've got a lot of help. We've enlisted all the companies you see up there on the screen in our European and US project spaces. We're a nonprofit convening many folks across the entire stakeholder supply chain. People from these companies meet with us every month, but also every week to strategize with us, along with brands and retailers and supply chain people in our other working groups. And everybody's been involved to help us design what are now our textile-to-textile trials, more of which I will speak to later. First, this is me in 2016. This is on a visit to an RPET, bottle to filament yarn factory, a vertically integrated factory outside of Shanghai, China. I worked for a company then, some of you probably know or have heard of, Samsonite, but the locals maybe in the room might know of that company as American Tourister, which is local, right? It's right in Warren, Rhode Island, or was, we're now in Mansfield. So I worked for the luggage industry for far too many years. I have a lot of baggage to show for it, literally. And when it comes to luggage, wherever you go, sort of there you are. I mean, there's just something about luggage. It's sort of like a real lowly guy. And the materials that go into it are fascinating and run the gamut of textiles, but also all the plastics that are involved. But one thing that I kind of always felt working in industrial design is that everything I was responsible for making and designing was never going to go away. I mean, I knew this was true. There was no away place for the things that we're making. And so you sort of have a sense of responsibility that grows with the work of design in that way. And when you observe and notice and talk to other people, it becomes more and more clear that a connection to the materials flowing into and out of our lives is just not really foremost for people. But clearly, this is changing. I mean, we're all here talking about this today. It is a story that's changing. And for example, 5 years ago, a company like Samsonite was hardly enthused by a project to incorporate recycled materials into their portfolio. They viewed it as a purely unnecessary, if not self-inflicted, disruption to an epically successful and established supply chain. By 2018, Samsonite was shipping product made with recycled PET into every one of its key accounts. And I can tell you, they have giant key accounts. At the time, I guess it was probably 2019, maybe even earlier, I was tallying it, of course, they had shipped the equivalent of 13 million bottles worth of luggage. By 2019, its CEO had hired a chief sustainability officer, and that same CEO was enthusiastically announcing plans for adoption of recycled PET across all of Samsonite's global regions. So things can change. Today I'm going to talk about, some of the research we're doing that many of you have already covered, the need, what the existing reality is today, and then what we're doing in our little way to transition to circularity. So there's been some progress, as I alluded to, especially on the plastics front. I mean, really, there's a lot of interesting work happening there. And the energy sector, too, in terms of the climate crisis, has a lot to say. The textile industry is dependent on both of these sectors, but it also has its own unique, far-reaching ties with land use, chemistry, certainly water, as well as with people. In 2019, global cotton production was, the volumes were about 25.5 million tons. Polyester was measured at 57.7 million tons. Man-made cellulosic was measured at 7.1 million tons. And it's thought that conservatively, because many people are not registered, about 430 million people work in the fashion and textile industry globally. Somewhere I read that's something like 1 out of every 8 workers. Virgin materials have high environmental impacts. For example, up on the screen, you'll probably have read it, 2,700 liters is needed to create 1 t-shirt of cotton in some cases. I mean, it depends on the dyeing processes and some other things. But certainly, this is a number for us to try and swallow. Textiles and the precious resources used to produce them are lost forever to us as individuals, but also to industry, when they end up, after reportedly shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter use phases, in our landfills. And this is happening at an ever-increasing rate. In 2019, 13 million tons of textiles, and somebody else put the figure up there, which is also correct, 18 million tons of textiles are landfilled and incinerated in the US every year. Our figure at Accelerating Circularity is 13 million tons, and that's because we took out the carpets and the footwear. So we're just left with pure textiles. US exports another 1 million tons from collection, and estimates are that the reality is probably about 30% higher than that. Worldwide, The tons of textile that are landfilled or incinerated globally every year is a staggering 92 million tons. Awareness of this problem is growing, clearly. There is consumer pushback, which was spoken about somewhat this morning. It's very important. New markets, as well as new products, are emerging, and a growing sense that people are willing to change behaviors in order to support more sustainable products and processes. And if, for example, I'm sure the students in this audience are well aware of the growing popularity of direct-to-consumer and peer-to-peer resale platforms such as ThreadUp, The RealReal, Poshmark, eBay, Facebook, Marketplace, good old Craigslist. All of these promote longer product use phases, which is essential. That reuse, reduce part of our waste hierarchy is very important. NGOs such as the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, Cradle to Cradle, Fashion Revolution, Fashion for Good, Global Fashion Agenda, WRAP, and it seems like 100 others who are all coming out with reports, I think, on a daily, if not hourly basis, all with well-meaning and what seem now to be obvious recommendations to reduce our carbon footprint or adopt circular practices, design for dismantle, design for recycling. All of these factors are putting tremendous pressure on business to change. Feeling that pressure, brands have volunteered, or maybe been forced in some cases by market dynamics, to declare ambitious goals and targets, many of which are predicated on the adoption of recycled fibers, some of which are highlighted up on this screen. I'll just take the polyester challenge from Textile Exchange as one example. In this campaign, they are asking brands to commit to a transition of virgin to recycled polyester to the tune of 45% by 2025, and by 2030, they're asking for this transition of virgin to recycled polyester to grow to 90%. Problem is, we don't have the capacity yet to fulfill that. It's a bold initiative, but how are we going to manage this? The infrastructure today simply doesn't exist to meet that demand. 14% of recycled content today equates to about 4.5 million tons. By 2025, 57.7 million tons is projected to grow to 68 million tons of polyester, with textiles accounting for about 37.7 million tons. A 45% increase in recycled content by 2025 represents a fourfold increase in capacity. 90% of content represents another 34% increase. So in 7 years, that would be an eightfold increase. According to a recent McKinsey report that came out just in June, called Scaling Textile Recycling in Europe, Turning Waste into Value. Within the European Union alone, demand for recycled fiber, not just polyester, but all recycled fibers, will outstrip supply to the tune of 60 to 70%. So how are we going to meet these commitments? Well, first we need to understand what's happening to textiles today. Today, sorting and grading for color and fabric happen, but the resulting fractions are typically unqualified for recycling to new fiber. Typically, I'm not going to say it's zero, but we don't want to deal in exceptions, especially if you're going to scale. Textile-to-textile production exists, but not yet with meaningful post-consumer quantities. Some post-industrial, for sure. One of them's back in the back of the room. Hello, Brickle. Hello, baseball. Where post-consumer textiles do get recycled, the output is limited to rag or shoddy and baseball yarn for industrial markets, B2Bs. Commercial bin owners leverage really cool, sophisticated software to track volumes, blends, and quality of their collected goods, but that quality is targeted for resale markets, not for recycled textiles. We will achieve circularity when we manage to shift some of these relationships. There's all this work going on, but it's not really aimed today at recycled textiles. This is a waste hierarchy. Some of you have probably seen variations of this model. You know, the sort of reduce, reuse, recycle, but it's blown up just a bit from that. In the US, for example, Goodwill International collects today over 9 billion garments per year. But according to the waste figures we have, that would factor to just 13% of the total available for collection and some form of resale or recycling. That other lost fraction equates to 87% every year. Collecting needs to be convenient and cost-effective for us to grow it. Massachusetts and California have passed textile waste bans recently in their states. There are also some states considering extender producer responsibility schemes. All of this could be very useful to help support more collection. If we look at the plastic bottle collection record to date, which I just think is a good instructive, there's reason to seek measures that mandate diversion. Demand for rPET increased 10% in 2020, rPET meaning the chip. But it was accompanied by a decrease in PET bottle collection. This is in the US. According to an annual report from the National Association of PET Container Resources, data shows that in 2020, PET bottles notched to a 26.6 collection rate, down from 27.9 in 2019. And in case you want to blame COVID, that was also already down from the year prior. 2018 measured 28.9. So over 70% or maybe 75% of the bottles available for collection are being lost. Side note, of what we are able to collect in bottles, we can't even recycle all of it. It matters how it's collected. It matters whether it's clean or not. It matters how contaminated it is. It's not enough just to collect it. Countries with deposit schemes, for example, in place manage to produce much cleaner collection of bottles. This incentivizes some companies to import recycled bottle flake from other countries. I think this is kind of crazy. Compared to textiles, however, PET bottle recycling is like a dream. It's a dream. It's a single source, single material, recognizable. Everybody knows what a bottle is. There's not, composite materials. There's not backings. There's not coatings. There's not thread holding it together. It's magical. So, you could kind of sit here and say, well, maybe if we could figure out the bottle problem, maybe we'll have a chance to figure out the textile problem. Anyway, I digress. Textiles collected today are collected for reuse and resale rather than for recycling. But we need to be clear that items for reuse and resale eventually do become unfit for circulation. They wear out. We call it spent textiles, and they must be considered for recycling. But what's appropriate in this space? There's domestic and international markets for resale and reuse. Who gets to decide when something is spent? Who gets to decide, where it should go next? And when we are implementing those decisions, how are we disrupting the other businesses that are dependent on these flows? Somebody mentioned earlier that, everything is connected, and when you it's like a web. If you pluck one part of the web, it's got reverberations across the entire system. This is a view of exporting versus importing countries for used clothing. It's a $3.87 billion industry. So, again, trying to track this idea of what happens to our textiles and clothing. Exporting countries is where we have the waste. The US, surprise, surprise, is a big waste producer. Importing countries have strong markets for secondhand reuse. But what about recycling? Today's importers of secondhand materials, there on the right, have very little ability to do more than reuse. When we talk about closing the loop for circular textiles, we are talking about big circles. We need lots and lots of solutions. And let me just make sure I don't lead anybody astray here. There are many countries taking in secondhand and have these reuse markets, and those same countries in some cases have very robust post-industrial processes happening, and in some cases they're also able to do quite a lot of sorting. But again, none of it is really connected up all the way through for textile to textile, recycling to fiber and yarn. We need transparency. That's a real loaded request. I mean, I think that the behavior change that was spoken about earlier is fundamental to even answering sincerely this challenge of transparency. And then finally, region by region, everything is often different, and we need to understand the manufacturing capabilities and the local, cultural, social impacts of any piece of this work in a circular system, region by region. This is just a picture, really, to say, here's what collected clothing looks like, all baled up. It's a very robust industry, very organized in many ways. As I said before, the US is the largest exporter of used clothing annually, 1 million tons. Sorting, also, the Hey Fashion report from that was referenced earlier by Eileen Fisher. I love that they are championing collection and sorting as sort of one of the number one things that needs to happen in a circular economy. There is a lot of sorting happening today, actually. We speak to sorters, especially in the European Union, where it's very well developed, by contrast to the United States, who sort to 200 plus grades. Some of them claim that they sort to 400 plus grades of textile at their facilities. This is a picture of some equipment from Tamra, who's local actually, but they don't do anything in the textile space locally here, but they are working on automated sorting solutions. But I will say this, as much as the technology is out there, and there's a lot that it will promise and help us to do, people and their hands, just like sewing of goods that we're buying, they remain at the center of everything. So what does this all add up to? It adds up to a robust inventory of existing capabilities that need new linkages, in order to mainstream a circular industry. This is another figure from the McKinsey report I cited earlier. Just in Europe alone, they cite a 3.5 to 4.5 billion euro opportunity for textile to textile industrialization. And they say that there's a projected holistic return on investment for that of 55 to 70%. Pretty sweet. There are some assumptions that this modeling of theirs is based upon, very small things like price parity and like virgin qualities in the textile to textile production space. Those of you who are the makers in this room know that any little shift in inputs to outputs affects prices, so there's lots of homework to be done there, lots of perhaps creative economic thinking that needs to happen, maybe changing those metrics of success that were referenced earlier. And like virgin qualities also, we are working with lots of mills who are accustomed to running continuous production processes where virgin, they've got it so dialed in to the virgin content that any little change to that input is a tremendous disruption. So the work we're doing at Accelerating Circularity aims to understand, test, and make recommendations that will ultimately prove, sometimes correct, maybe even remodel the business case for circular textiles, such as we understand it today. So I've shared some of the takeaways from our research, but that's just the fuel for the real work we do. Mapping and modeling new value chains, linking up the people behind the processes, and then piloting actual materials from collection through to finished fabrics at commercial scale is what we are doing now. We are currently running 12 US-based trials, all of which are located in North America and wherever possible within the conterminous United States. We have also a sister project in Europe, but I'm not going to talk about that today. We are aiming to make basics: jersey knits, poly-cotton blended fleeces, cotton toweling, denim, canvas, and twill weaves. We're working with Polartec to do 100% polyester Polartec fleece as well. I mentioned it because somebody here in the room. And our goal is a baseline of 20% post-consumer content with an overall minimum recycled content of 40%. This is our area of work in this map. You can see the area in white represents collection, sorting, pre-processing, and recycling, whereas the area in purple is the existing supply chain, which is fiber through spinning, fabric production, cut and sew, all the way through to the retailer, and then the brand and the retailer. All of these processes are fundamental to the textile-to-textile system. Our work explicitly is about linking businesses in the white area, many of which are highly developed with established domestic and international resale markets, to existing textile supply chains. So this is truly, connecting the links and making this circular system as opposed to linear. We are also working closely with fiber, yarn, and textile producers through our commercial trials to identify manufacturing requirements unique to recycled inputs and outputs. We're running materials through all these processes at minimum bulk order quantities. So we're running at production levels in order to learn something that you probably can't learn when you're at the lab, actually. And boy, I can tell you, there is a lot of cat herding involved in this process to work at, with these existing technologies at scale. In addition to post-consumer, it's important to factor post-industrial waste and unsold merchandise into feedstock flow creation. As you can see from a global perspective, post-industrial feedstocks are most commonly utilized by recyclers today. There's a reason. Post-industrial is a pre-sorted feedstock, generally, whose color, format, and constructions are known. Contamination in the form of metals, trims, and seams is often a non-issue from a post-industrial perspective. And they're a byproduct, right, of yarn, spinning, cutting room floors, final cut and sew assembly, and leftovers. So post-industrial is a very important part of a textile-to-textile system. Speaking of systems, this is our attempt at one of those mind-boggling, charts to show how things flow. In this view, we are capturing on the right a list of all the elements involved in our trials and reflection of a textile-to-textile system ecology, along with the relations between them. Importantly, and central to this map, you can see, and maybe you can't because it's in yellow, unfortunately, you can see pre-processing and aggregation. Pre-processing and aggregation to create the raw materials for a recycling system is emerging from our work as if not the key element to building a commercial scale circular textile system. Someone once described it to me as a refinery of sorts. This is truly the place where textile waste, and I agree, there's no such thing as waste, there's just something at the wrong place at the wrong time, turns into mainstream, raw materials. Inclusion is a guiding principle at our work in these trials. Collaboration is a must-have for the project. It's not a nice-to-have. All our participants are also active. In previous experience trying to solve for circularity in the textile space, people have learned that you just can't do it alone, and that's part of our education that we're bringing to industry. Companies still, big brands, I mean, you saw the brands, some of them are the biggest brands. None of them are gonna be able to supply the recycling system alone. They have to collaborate and there has to be aggregation. Even the largest brands will not be able to supply sufficient flow. I want people to think about it as flow. And the breadth of qualities, because it's not just one quality, it's all the qualities that need to be in a choreographed dance of sorts for this to scale. You guys still with me? Here's a photo of, some hands, because it's going to take hands. But really, the pre-processing piece of this ecosystem is fundamental, and also it's unique for textile recycling. And by the way, there's not just one type of pre-processing that has to happen. I mean, all the different recycling technologies, whether you're talking about advanced chemical recycling of polyesters, whether you're talking about thermomechanical recycling of polyesters, mechanical cotton, cellulosic semi-chemical recycling, honestly, all of them have different feedstock specifications, and the company by company, it may also change. And the sort of race to the moon that we're having right now is there's a narrow bandwidth because some of the technologies are so new, they're at demo scale, they need to be careful, and it's a very disruptive process we all need to learn. But the race to the moon is to open up the specs, right, to make the specs a little broader so that the pipe fill, so to speak, can broaden for things to flow in. On the other side of it is the collection and sorting and pre-processing. That whole area of work needs to also become more advanced so that the understanding of what kind of buckets things get sorted into, whether it's by fiber, by color, by construction, by complexity, perhaps. Things like, things that have buttons and zippers and labels. You have to know that for both polyester and cotton recycling, in many cases, all those things have to be removed. And if you're talking about a post-industrial input that we call coming in from the wild, you can just imagine, I wish I had the other picture up there, just, a mountain of clothes, all of different size, shapes, constructions, trying to make sense out of this reverse input coming in from the wild is no small feat. So that's where the post-industrial piece of it is sort of very helpful, because you can blend into an aggregated form of feedstocks from more or less known inputs. Also, there's interesting opportunities in terms of the uniform space, the hospitality space, these sort of business-to-business spaces where there are textiles circulating, but they are, again, relatively narrow in spec. There's an opportunity there. Uniform industries are already really interestingly sophisticated. One group that we worked with, Cintas, and they're not the only ones, they are often wedded to industrial launderers. And, it's, when you think about it, it's sort of a miracle that, Charlie Jones goes to his locker or her locker, and the piece of clothing with their name in it goes out of their locker into an industrial laundering, Monsters, Inc. situation, and comes back and is hanging in their locker 3 days later with their name on it. It's their piece of clothing. The systems that are in place with barcodes and tracking and baling and aggregating and then washing and keeping everything straight, this is incredible technology that's already in place. It's just not targeted for textile-to-textile recycling yet. So here is a little snapshot of the actual pilots we're doing. There are 12 of them, and we've got 32 individual participants across the spectrum of stakeholders that we're engaged with. 11 of them are brands. The brands are very important. They are representing, they represent, let's face it, the money. They're the pull-through. And we've got 12 trials, as I said, 7 different product categories that I mentioned earlier, 9 participating brands, again, all within the North American and/or American territories. We are producing 19 unique yarns and the number of, the volume of yarns that we're looking to output across all of our 12 trials is adding up to 144,000 pounds of yarn. So, to date, we've been able to collect, we shipped 4,000 pounds of post-consumer feedstock into one of our partners. They were able to refiberize that material, and then we were able to spin it with our partners, as well as knit it into a very viable, beautiful, I must say, 26 singles jersey knit that we were able to then share out to all the brands who, I have to say, are very, very excited about what they are seeing and feeling. In the polyester space, we've also proven out our proof of concept, similarly with post-consumer inputs that have been made into staple fibers, spun, knit, and shared with our partners. So we have a vision for circular textile systems, as you can, I hope, hear by now. And our areas of work and our deliverables basically line up to this. We need standards for recyclable inputs. Grades is another way to think about that. We've got to understand and engage in the sorting and pre-processing requirements to meet those standards. We need development of material flows. It's not enough that anybody can come up with something once. There's got to be continuous flow of inputs. And we need inclusion of post-consumer, post-industrial, and unsold textile feedstocks to make this happen and to control the quality. So any business case for circular systems must include people, planet, and profits. We have no reason to change, though, unless we want to improve each one of these areas. Of the new circular textile value chain steps, we must look for improvement on where we are at today for all of these levels. We need to ask ourselves if the transition we are making provides a better life for those working in the system, and if our products are safer, cleaner, and less of a burden on the environment. So please, brands and suppliers, there's probably more suppliers in the room today, respond to our call to action with information and participation. You can help us by going to our website, registering your interest there. Municipalities, designers, consumers, policymakers, please help. We need the support. The system needs the support to help create the right incentives and conditions for textiles to go circular. Thank you.